How should the wrists work when it comes to chipping and the short game? Well, that's a very large question with a wide range of answers, really depending on the shot you're trying to hit. This video is going to discuss 3 basic shots, 3 basic wrist motions that you can use to improve your short game skills around the green and help you to get up and down more often. To help me show you how the wrists work for these different chipping and pitching shots around the green, I'm going to be incorporating the use of the HackMotion wrist sensor. And I'll start by saying that when it comes to the short game, there's almost an infinite number of ways that you could use your wrists, which makes this topic quite overwhelming and a little bit daunting for many people. But just because there are almost infinite ways that you could use your wrists doesn't mean to say there aren't more optimal ways. And today I'm going to try and isolate those movements for you by teaching you a basic low shot for chipping, a basic mid-range shot for pitching around the green for most of your shots, and then how you can hit that very high, soft landing lob shot that will help you if you're in the bunker or trying to get up and down from very close to the edge of the green. So those are the 3 shots we're going to talk about today. And as we go through the video, I'm going to be referencing how the wrists move. Just a very quick recap on some of the wrist movements. In this up and down plane of motion, we're referring to ulnar deviation when the wrist goes down and radial deviation when the wrist goes up. Ulnar is when the wrist goes down, like so. Radial is when you hinge the wrist up in this condition, like so. That's in the up and down plane of motion. And then back and forth, like so. The lead wrist can move into flexion, where the palm's pointing up towards me, or into extension, when the back of the wrist is cupped and the palm's facing down. Flexion and extension of the lead wrist is also going to change how this club behaves. Let's start with the very basic short shot, the chip shot you'd use from just off the edge of the green. And you can use this with any club in your bag, but for the purpose of this video, I'm using a 56-degree sand wedge for all of these shots. If I wanted to hit the most basic, simple, low chip shot, I would start by standing much closer to the ball than I would for any other shot, really, even putting. I'm going to get myself as close to the ball as I can so that I get the shaft on this most vertical or upright plane that I can. And in doing so, I'm going to be putting my wrists into this ulnar deviation condition where I almost feel like my fingers or thumbs are pointing down at the ground. That's a nice position for them to be because in this condition, they tend to stay quite stable. This is also generally a good position for your wrists to be during putting. It's a nice position to try and get the wrists for putting because stable wrist conditions tend to mean less volatile face rotation. So when it comes to this basic shot, standing closer to the ball and getting the shaft more upright, puts my wrists into this ulnar condition. And then as I swing, I'm going to try and retain the sensation in the backswing and the follow through of pointing my fingers and my thumb down towards the ground. This looks like a relatively simple action, and in theory it should be. If I'm able to keep my wrists and my cocking of my wrists stable, so this condition stable, I should find that the strike here becomes very predictable. Extremely solid contact there, and as I'm hitting that shot, I'm really trying to keep my thumbs and my fingers pointing down towards the ground for as long as possible, keeping this shaft in this down condition. You'll see there from the data how the ulnar deviation in the wrist stayed very stable there from setup through to the backswing, through to impact. And beyond impact, I'm still trying to maintain that sensation of keeping the wrists down. I find this to be a really useful shot off of a multitude of lies. You can play this shot from a good lie, but equally this works from a very, very tight lies around the green when there's very little grass under the ball. And it's also very good if you've got a slightly fluffy lie because the club tends to cut through on this more vertical plane. This really is a very simple but extremely effective way to hit a low chip and run shot that's very predictable and should help you next time you're just off the edge of the green. Having showed you how to hit the low one, let's go to the other end of the spectrum first before we find that nice middle ground by hitting the high shot, the lob shot around the green, the one that looks really cool, but the one that when you get it wrong really does cost you a lot of shots. What do you need to do to hit the ball high? Well, from a wrist perspective, we need to see a lot more wrist hinge, radial deviation, there's an upward movement of the wrist, and some more lead wrist extension, which is going to help to keep the club face open, because ultimately it's an open club face, more loft at the ball, delivered at impact, that's going to help the ball to fly higher. So the opposite of what we did for the very low short shot would be to stand a little further from the ball this time. I'm going to widen my stance and have the shaft of the golf club a little bit lower than I would typically have it. I'm also going to start with the club face a few degrees open as well, because I'm trying to add as much loft as possible. But the real key here begins to happen in the backswing, how the lead wrist stays in some extension. There's an angle or some cupping here in the back of the wrist. And this is very, very contrary to what you would want to do in a regular full swing. It'd be the exact opposite, in fact, which is why so many people struggle with this lob shot, or if it's a bunker shot as well. Very similar mechanics, and very similar wrist action that's necessary. If I started out here with some 17 degrees of extension, there's 22 degrees, 23 degrees of extension in my lead wrist. I swing back, I want to try and maintain that. There's 26 degrees. My tendency, my preference, or the natural feel for me would actually be to have the face a bit more closed like I do in my regular swing, but that's not going to work if I want to hit the ball high. So keeping the extension here, so that as you swing back, there's almost a sense of twisting the face or twisting the shaft a little bit open. That's going to help me to hold the loft on the face as I come down, deliver that extra loft, and help me hit the ball high. Into the follow through, same thing to be said, keep the extension in the lead wrist. The way to see that is that the club face is still pointing back towards me. I haven't allowed the club face to twist or roll down towards the ground. So the extension in the wrist, the cupping in the wrist, exists in both the backswing and in the follow through. Well, it certainly went up very high. That hit the top of the screen there. It's a super high, soft landing shot. Compared to the chip shot, completely different wrist mechanics. They couldn't be any more different. Was I able to retain some of that extension? I was. So I started with 29 degrees of extension there at setup, and I still had 25 degrees when I hit the ball. Once again, these mechanics are very different to full swing mechanics, which is why lots of people get confused between one or the other. Hitting this high shot requires a very specific, very different movement with the wrist. As you swing back, make sure there's an angle here in that lead wrist. That's the extension. The club face will be looking straight back towards you if you're doing this correctly, up towards me. And as I swing down, keeping the extension and that feeling in the wrist as I follow through, the club face still looks back at me. Once again, that's that extension. The more extension you add on the backswing and the follow through, the higher the shot will go, the more open the club face will be. That's the skill you need to practice. That's the movement of the wrist you need to practice if you want to master the ability to hit that high shot. It's generally a little bit easier to do when you have some grass under the ball, a little bit of margin of error. But if you get these wrist mechanics correct, you can hit this lob shot off of any lie. You watch the best players in the world demonstrate that. That doesn't make it easy. I'm just saying it makes it possible. So with the right understanding and the right execution of the wrist angles, you should be able to hit this high, soft lob shot or bunker shot very, very easily. Quick question for you. Did you know that 80% of your golf ball's direction comes from the club face angle at impact? And it's your wrists that control that angle. If you want to hit straighter shots and add more distance to your game, then check out the link in the description below. And finally, let's talk about the mid-flighted or stock shot, I call it, for the majority of players I help. This is the one you're going to use around the green almost as much as possible, because it's the one that allows you to control both the flight, the spin, and the overall rollout of the shot. It's not a high-risk shot. This should be something that's relatively easy for you to execute once you understand how to do it. It won't surprise you to know that the mid shot sits somewhere between the two extremes that we've already discussed. So we don't want to be super close to the ball with the shaft up and the ulnar deviation or the wrist pointing down. And equally, we don't want to be far away from the ball with the shaft down, using lots of extension in the wrists to hit the ball high. It's going to be somewhere in the middle. Now, how do you feel that? Well, my preference here is to set up with a mid distance from the ball. The club's in its most natural condition. The shaft isn't excessively up or down. It's in its natural playing condition. And I like to have the club face relatively square to 1 or 2 degrees open. That's just a preference I have with the short game. I like to see a little bit of loft on the club face. But from a distance from the ball point of view, I'm really just setting up with the club in its normal standard condition. My feet are about hip width apart with my toes turned out slightly. The ball is positioned in the middle of my stance. Now, lots of people struggle with this shot because as they take the club back, they tend to get the club working too much inside with this club face too closed. As I touched on briefly earlier, this would be more akin to a full swing pattern that many of you will be trying to incorporate into your swing, because closing the face in the full swing helps you to hit the ball far, helps you to draw the ball. In short game, this is less beneficial, particularly getting the club head too far in and behind you can lead to lots of contact issues. If this gets too low and too shallow, you'll find a lot of the time the club bottoms out before the ball, resulting in fat shots or thin shots. So what we really want to be able to make sure we control in this early part of the backswing is the amount of upward wrist hinge that you manage to have in your swing. This is referred to as radial deviation, the upward hinging of the wrists in this direction. From front view, this would look like so. This upward hinging is happening while you're moving the club back. It's not really happening at any specific point in time. It's not like you go back in one piece and then you add the wrist hinge. There's a progressive, gradual adding of this wrist hinge. But in order to be able to identify it and show it to you, I'll teach it to you in a way that I often use for students, just to help them move the club from this static condition at setup to adding in some radial deviation, where they're just raising the club head away from the ground and away from the ball using the upward hinge of the wrists. This is the radial deviation. And then I'll say just make a half a backswing where you turn your chest, your belly, your hips, my belt buckle here, I turn back towards the camera. That amount of rotation matched with this amount of radial, this little bit of raising of the club, helps to just keep the club head moving on the correct plane. And for me, in short game, that's really the number one trick that better short game players possess over people who struggle with this shot. Keeping the club head and the shaft working up the shaft plane is a really nice way to think about how this club should move. Getting it too far outside, and particularly getting it too far under or inside, is a massive issue that I see with tons of golfers every single day. So learning this small amount of radial in the backswing really helps to set the club up on the shaft plane correctly, as opposed to just moving the club around on its own. So many of you are trying to minimize the movement in this motion. You're trying to think that less is more. And to an extent, you're correct. But if you really don't move your wrists at all and you just try to move the club back with some sort of pivot, you're invariably going to get the club too shallow. Like I say, number one mistake. So as you set up to the ball with a standard setup, add some radial, turn back towards the camera in my example. I've managed to set this wrist, retain a little bit of this lead wrist extension, which again is good for this chip shot. And I'm in a great position now to hold what feels like maintaining these wrist angles and turn through to the target. When I finish, I want the same feeling. I want a little bit of this upward radial deviation. I don't want my wrist to roll or twist. So I'm really trying to keep a sense, and the feeling I often use for my students is this angle here that I have at setup between the forearm, the wrist and the club is going to increase slightly in the backswing. That's this movement. Just feel like the club head hinges up slightly, and then as I come through, I'm going to finish, I'm going to have the same feeling that the club head is hinged up slightly. The entirety of this movement is matched with a body pivot that pulls the arms along for the ride. This is not an arms only swing. Just because it's a short shot doesn't mean we don't use the body. The body's very involved. The pivot of the arms and the body should be somewhat in sync. So once we've got that information, we understand the feel of the backswing and the feel of the follow through, we can go ahead and hit one. Really nice, crisp contact, which I would expect you to see and experience if you're managing the way that this club's traveling up and down the shaft plane there. The data on that one will show that I had not as much of the extension or the radial deviation as I did on the high shot, and again, not as much of the ulnar as I did on the low shot. Somewhere in the middle, and that's really the key to learning this mid shot. I feel like in order to hit this shot, my tummy really moves with my club. And so a good exercise here to feel for the pivot is to have the club just touching your belly as you move the club back and through. That's going to teach you the body mechanics for this shot, the back and through, but this doesn't teach you the wrist that you need. The problem here is the wrist is staying too ulnar deviated. We need some radial mixed into this. So if you struggle with the body pivot, you can put the club in your belly like this and just practice turning back and through. This is where we want to finish, with the chest, the belly, the golf club, all pointing in the same direction. But as far as the wrists are concerned, we want that same pivot with a bit of the radial deviation built into that backswing. So that's going to be club hinges up, hit the ground, the club hinges up again. Radial, radial, wrist cock, wrist cock. The amount you do is going to vary from player to player. There's no exact amount that's 100% correct. But finding your middle ground between the two extremes will help you to take a selection of shots out onto the golf course that can really help you to lower your scores. Effectively, if you can master these three shots, these three types of shot around the green, a low, a high and a mid, then you're really going to have a lot of options when it comes to getting the ball up and down when you miss the green. I hope you found the video useful. There's some practical tips you can take away immediately there and try. If you have the HackMotion wrist sensor, you can also start to measure what your lead wrist is doing throughout these different shots and hopefully start to identify where you may be needing to put the work in. If you'd like to learn more about the wrist angles and how they can influence your club face and ultimately the improvement of your golf, go ahead and click in the link down in the description for more wrist videos.